The officers' club at the airbase was a place of success, a carefully maintained space of polished wood, comfortable leather chairs, and the quiet, confident atmosphere of achievement. The air itself seemed different here, carrying the faint scent of expensive refreshments and the quiet pride of military service. Portraits of serious four-star generals from decades past hung on the walls, their painted eyes serving as silent witnesses to the current generation. Tonight, the club was alive, celebrating a successful military exercise. Laughter echoed off the high ceilings as young officers gathered around the center of attention in the room. Brigadier General Kevin Drake. Drake was a man built from ambition. His jaw was sharp, his gaze was sharper, and his uniform was perfect without a single wrinkle. He was a master of supply chains, a genius at getting equipment where it needed to go, a man who could move mountains of material across continents with a few computer commands. But understanding people was difficult for him, and the reality of actual combat had never touched him personally. His authority came not from shared hardship in the field, but from strictly enforcing regulations. He saw the world as a grand checklist, and his primary duty was to find and publicly point out any box left unchecked. His gaze, sweeping the room with an almost hunting sense of ownership, caught on something that didn't fit in his perfect world. In a corner, almost lost in the long shadows cast by a tall bookshelf of military history, a man was cleaning. An old man, probably nearing 70, whose gray work uniform seemed dull compared to the polished atmosphere of the room. This was George Martin. His movements were slow, careful, marked by a slight limp that favored his left leg. He polished the brass nameplate on a display case containing a Vietnam-era flight helmet with a care that seemed unusual for someone in his position. He was a ghost at the party, a necessary but invisible worker whose presence was, to Drake, somehow offensive. Leaning toward three captains who hung on his every word, Drake lowered his voice to a near whisper. "Gentlemen, a teachable moment," he began, a smirk touching his lips. "The chain of command is not just a diagram. It's a representation of value. At the top, decision makers. At the bottom," he gestured with his chin toward the old janitor. "Notice the lack of proper bearing, the casual disregard for the importance of this place. Such things, if left uncorrected, are like rust. They damage the very structure of our discipline." The captains nodded eagerly, their eyes reflecting their general's casual disrespect. Encouraged by his audience, Drake set his drink down with a decisive click and walked across the expensive rug, his polished shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. The ambient chatter of the room seemed to follow his progress, conversation stopping as dozens of pairs of eyes locked onto him. They sensed a show was about to happen. Drake stopped directly behind George, who was now carefully wiping down the glass of the display case. His reflection, a bent, blurry figure against the history preserved within. "Attendant," Drake's voice cut sharply through the hushed room. "This is a restricted function for commissioned officers and their invited guests. Your duties were to be concluded before 1800 hours. Explain your presence." George finished a long, smooth wipe before straightening up, a slow and clearly painful process. He turned, his face showing the lines carved by time and hardship. His eyes, a pale and washed-out blue, held a deep tiredness, but they met the general's gaze without flinching. "My apologies, General," he said, his voice rough with age. "The event supervisor requested I remain on standby in case of any spills. Just trying to keep the place looking its best for you, gentlemen." Drake let out a short, mocking sound. "Looking its best? Your very presence here takes away from the atmosphere. This club is a monument to warriors, to pilots who faced danger, to strategists who outmaneuvered our enemies. It is a special space. It is not a utility closet for you to hang around in." He ran a critical eye over George's worn uniform, the faint stains on the knees. "Frankly, it's an embarrassment." The insult, so personal and so public, hung in the air. The room had fallen into a deep, uncomfortable silence. This was no longer a simple correction. It was a public shaming. George's weathered face remained calm, showing practiced control. "I understand, sir. I'll gather my things and leave you to your event." But Drake hadn't finished with his little power play. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a tone of fake curiosity that was somehow more insulting than his previous outburst. Tell me, old man, since you seem so comfortable in this hall of heroes, did you ever do your part? Did you ever wear a uniform? Or has your entire contribution to this nation been with a mop and a bucket? He looked back at his captains, a self-satisfied expression on his face. The weight of every stare in the room pressed down on George. He looked at the floor for a long moment, at the patterns of the rug, before his pale blue eyes lifted to meet Drake's again. There was a flicker of something ancient in them, a spark of a long-dormant fire. "Yes, General," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of truth. "I served." Drake's smirk widened. "Oh, you served. Wonderful," he exclaimed with theatrical joy. "Do tell us all. I'm fascinated. Were you a clerk? Someone pushing papers at some forgotten records facility? Perhaps a cook's assistant, ensuring the officer's food was never cold? There's no shame in it, of course," he added, though his tone said otherwise. "Every part of the machine has its purpose, no matter how small." As George bent down to place a bottle of polish back into his cart, the cuff of his uniform rode up his forearm, revealing a piece of skin that hadn't seen the sun in 50 years. There, faded to a blurry greenish gray, was a tattoo of a snake, coiled and ready to strike. Drake's eyes, trained to spot any detail out of place, locked onto it. This was the final piece he needed for his performance. "And what is that?" he asked, pointing a rigid finger. "A memento of your fierce battles with a clogged drain? A symbol of your daring supply runs to the store?" He leaned in, his voice meant for the entire room. "I must know. What was the fearsome call sign they gave the man who cleaned the restrooms? Sponge 6. Captain Comet?" The young officers laughed obediently. Drake's grin was one of pure triumph. He had cornered his prey. He had reduced the old man to a joke for his own amusement. "Speak up," he commanded. "I want to hear it. What was your call sign?" George straightened up one last time. The bent shoulders seemed to square themselves almost imperceptibly. The tiredness in his eyes vanished, burned away by that strange spark from deep within. The background noise of the club seemed to fall silent. The world narrowed to the space between the two men. George's gaze was no longer deferential. It was hard, like stone. He drew a slow, quiet breath. When he spoke, his voice was a gravelly whisper that held the authority of a long-forgotten ghost. "My call sign," he said, the words falling into the silence like stones into a deep well, "was Viper 1. The name landed in the room and exploded. For Drake and the younger generation of officers, it was meaningless. Just a slightly more dramatic name than the ones he'd mocked. But for a select few, the name was a key to a locked room in military history. At the far end of the bar, Command Sergeant Major Paul Richards, a man whose face showed years of service in dangerous places from Vietnam to the Middle East, dropped his glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound sharp in the dead quiet. Richards' face had drained of color, leaving it pale and shocked. He wasn't looking at a janitor anymore. He was staring at a legend. He'd heard that name once, and only once, whispered over a crackling radio frequency during a dangerous patrol in Cambodia in 1971. A voice from nowhere directing air support to stop an entire enemy battalion that was about to overrun his position. A voice that had identified itself only as Viper 1 before vanishing back into the static. The other senior soldiers in the room had the same reaction. A master gunnery sergeant from the Marine Guard took an involuntary step backward, his hand reflexively going to where a weapon would be. A chief master sergeant in charge of base security looked as if he'd been struck. The atmosphere didn't just get tense. It became heavy, charged with a fear and a kind of respect that the younger officers couldn't comprehend. Drake, protected by his own ignorance, only saw the janitor's defiance. "Viper 1? How very dramatic," he sneered, though the reactions of his own senior enlisted personnel had planted a tiny seed of doubt in his mind. "A big name for a small man. You think that impresses—" His voice trailed off as the great oak doors of the main entrance were thrown open with a booming crash that silenced him completely. Framed in the doorway stood General Wallace, the four-star commander, a man whose quiet displeasure was more feared than anything. His face was serious, and his eyes, famous for their ability to see through excuses, were intense. He was flanked by two stone-faced men in dark suits whose lapel pins identified them as special investigators. Wallace's presence was overwhelming. He was supposed to be testifying before Congress in Washington, D.C. Ignoring the stunned salutes and shocked faces of everyone in the room, General Wallace strode forward with unstoppable momentum. His eyes scanned the bizarre scene, the shattered glass, the terrified senior soldiers, the pompous brigadier general, and the quiet old janitor. Wallace's gaze flew past Drake's single star as if it were nothing and locked onto George Martin with an intensity that made the air crackle. He came to a halt 2 feet from George, his posture perfectly straight. In the stunned silence, he snapped to attention and delivered the sharpest, most profound salute of his career. It was a gesture of utter, unconditional respect. A salute a general gives not to a subordinate, but to a legend. "Mr. Martin," Wallace said, his voice carrying an emotion no one had ever heard from him before. "Sir, it is an honor beyond words. Forgive this intrusion." He held the salute, his hand trembling slightly, before slowly lowering it. Only then did he turn his head, his gaze falling upon the now terrified Brigadier General Drake like a physical weight. "General Drake," Wallace said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm whisper. "I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to consider your answer very carefully. Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" Drake, his face pale, his mind reeling, could only manage a pathetic stammer. "Sir, he's the custodial engineer." Wallace's eyes closed for a brief second, as if in immense pain. "Let me be the last person to ever have to educate you, Brigadier General. You are not fit to polish the boots this man has forgotten he owned. The janitor you have been humiliating for the last 10 minutes is the man the entire intelligence community of the United States and NATO knew by one designation and one designation only, Viper 1. Wallace took a deliberate step toward Drake, who flinched as if expecting something worse. This man led special reconnaissance teams across enemy lines for 3 straight years. His team was so effective that the enemy offered a reward for his capture worth more than a brand new fighter jet. He was captured once. Once. He was taken to a prison camp that didn't officially exist, a place so difficult it was known only as the Kennel. He escaped 2 weeks later, carrying 2 of his wounded men on his back for 80 miles through dense jungle. Wallace's voice grew harder, each word a hammer blow. After Vietnam, he was recruited for special operations. That tattoo you mocked? It represents some of the most dangerous missions in American history. He is the man who walked into places the best intelligence agencies said were impossible to enter and single-handedly dismantled their operations in one night. Operation Serpent's Kiss. Look it up. Oh, wait. You can't. It's classified at a level of secrecy that you, General, do not have the clearance to even know exists. He pointed at George. He spent 6 months in the worst prison in Eastern Europe, and when he escaped, he did so with intelligence that single-handedly prevented a surprise invasion of Western Europe and possibly prevented a major conflict. The 4-star general now stood close to the brigadier general, his presence overwhelming. "And you, a supply officer whose greatest hardship was a delayed shipment of office furniture, you dared stand in this room, on floors he now humbly cleans, and question his service. You are an insult to the uniform you wear." Wallace's voice dropped to its most dangerous whisper. "Be in my office at Oro 600 tomorrow. Bring your full-dress uniform, your resignation letter, and whatever is left of your honor. Your career in the United States Air Force is over. Now get out of my sight before I do something we'll both regret." Utterly and completely broken, Drake turned and stumbled out of the club, his public destruction complete. Wallace watched him go, then addressed the silent, shocked room. "Let this be a lesson for every one of you. The true heroes of this nation are not always the ones with stars on their shoulders. They are the quiet professionals, the unseen warriors, the men like George Martin who sacrificed everything in the shadows so that you could stand here safe in the light." He turned back to George, his expression softening with a deep, profound respect. "George," he said gently, "it's over. Your nation has not forgotten you. There's been an error regarding your service benefits and pension going back 30 years. It's been fixed. It's time to come home." George Martin stood there for a long moment, the weight of decades seeming to lift from his shoulders. His pale blue eyes, which had held such tiredness just moments before, now glistened with something else. Not tears exactly, but the release of a burden carried for far too long. "Sir," George said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "I never expected anyone to remember. I just did what needed to be done." "That's exactly why you deserve to be remembered," Wallace replied firmly. "The best among us never seek recognition. They simply serve." As General Wallace gently guided George Martin toward the door, a ripple went through the room. The command sergeant major was the first, snapping to the most rigid, heartfelt position of attention of his life. The rest of the senior soldiers followed suit instantly, their faces showing a mixture of respect and understanding that only those who had truly served could comprehend. Then the officers, one by one, their faces showing shame and awe, all snapped to attention, their hands rising in a salute that was not for a janitor, but for a titan, for a man who had walked through fire so that others could live in peace. The younger officers, who moments before had laughed at Drake's cruel jokes, now stood with burning faces, realizing they had been complicit in mocking a true American hero. It was a lesson they would carry for the rest of their careers. That valor doesn't always wear stars, that sacrifice doesn't always seek recognition, and that the greatest warriors often walk among us unseen. As George walked toward the exit, supported gently by General Wallace's hand on his shoulder, he paused at the doorway. He turned back to face the room one final time, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the assembled officers and enlisted personnel. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice stronger now, carrying the authority that had once commanded men in the most dangerous situations imaginable. "Never judge a book by its cover. The uniform doesn't make the warrior. The warrior makes the uniform, remember that." With those final words, George Martin, Viper 1, walked out of the officers' club, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget what they had witnessed that night. In the days that followed, the story spread through the military community like wildfire. General Kevin Drake's resignation was quietly processed, and he left the service in disgrace. The incident became a mandatory case study at the Air Force Academy, teaching future officers about respect, humility, and the danger of judging others based on their current circumstances rather than their past contributions. George Martin, meanwhile, was finally given the recognition he deserved. The corrected pension and benefits allowed him to live comfortably for the first time in decades. But more importantly, he was invited to speak at military academies and training facilities, where young service members would sit in reverent silence as he shared stories, not of his own heroism, but of the importance of teamwork, sacrifice, and putting mission above self. The display case that George had been cleaning that fateful night was updated with a new plaque. Beneath the Vietnam-era flight helmet, it now read, "In honor of George Martin, call sign, Viper 1. A reminder that heroes walk among us, often unseen and unrecognized, but never forgotten by those who truly understand the meaning of service." The officers' club itself became a different place after that night. The atmosphere of casual superiority was replaced by something deeper, a genuine respect for all who served, regardless of their current position or past glory. Officers who once might have walked past maintenance staff without a second glance now stopped to say hello, to ask about their day, to treat them with the dignity that every person deserves. And sometimes, late at night when the club was quiet, you could find senior officers standing in front of that display case, looking at the plaque and the helmet, reminded of a fundamental truth, that the measure of a person isn't found in their rank or their position, but in their character and their willingness to serve something greater than themselves. George Martin had spent years in the shadows, his contributions forgotten by all but a few. But on that one night, when an arrogant general tried to humiliate him, the truth came to light. And in doing so, he taught a lesson more valuable than any classroom instruction, that true honor cannot be dimmed by time, that genuine sacrifice never loses its value, and that the quiet professionals who ask for nothing are often the ones who deserve everything. The story of Viper 1 became more than just a tale of recognition delayed. It became a testament to the countless men and women who serve in silence, who do what must be done without seeking glory, who carry their burdens without complaint. George Martin represented all of them. The unsung heroes whose names we may never know, but whose sacrifices make our freedom possible. And for George himself, the recognition, while appreciated, was never the point. When asked by a young cadet what he wanted people to remember about that night, he simply smiled and said, "I hope they remember that everyone deserves respect. From the four-star general to the person cleaning the floors. We're all part of the same team, all working toward the same goal. That's what matters." In the end, George Martin taught the military community a lesson it should never have needed to learn, but clearly did. That greatness often wears the most humble disguise, and that the true measure of our character is found not in how we treat those above us, but in how we treat those we believe to be beneath us. The heroes who walk among us often carry the heaviest burdens with the quietest grace.